ICBC, the world's biggest and most profitable bank, this year will make about 7 times as much profit as Goldman Sachs, and is getting to the point where if it keeps growing at the same rate, it would be able to buy Goldman Sachs out of 1 year's profits. I think speculation about the Chinese banks bailing out the eurozone or individual members has been around for quite a while. Indeed, I discussed that very question in Beijing in February with a think tank of people who report directly to the State Council. And their view, I think this is even more true now, is that it's a bit difficult domestically to justify to the Chinese people that their hard-earned foreign exchange reserves are being used to bail out, by their standards, quite wealthy countries with advanced health systems and good pensions, when they themselves are quite a long way off that. So I think there's a political barrier, but also whether it might have been a good idea back in February. Right now, there's so much risk around the eurozone that I really don't think any Chinese bank or government agency could come in until it's clear that the dust has settled and it's safe. Otherwise, they run the risk of enormous political damage to their career. The Chinese banks are, by market value or by profits, amongst the world's biggest now. Indeed, 4 of the world's most profitable, 5 most profitable banks are Chinese. And one view would be, if you've got all this firepower, if you're making 4 or 5 times as much money each year as Goldman Sachs, are you just going to stay in China and carry on making money? Well, I think the answer is no. It's clear already that these banks want to expand, or at least their management do. The question is, of course, whether the Chinese government wants them to, and if so, how. So I think it's only a matter of time before they make an impact on the rest of the world. They've already made a number of small acquisitions, but so far it's been minimal, and we're really waiting to see what they're going to do. The Chinese banks have the potential to threaten other banks around the world, not least because they could buy them, assuming, of course, that would be permitted. ICBC, the world's biggest and most profitable bank, this year will make about 7 times as much profit as Goldman Sachs, and is getting to the point where if it keeps growing at the same rate, it would be able to buy Goldman Sachs out of 1 year's profits. Now, that would be highly controversial. It's not necessarily even the smart thing for them to do, but their sheer capacity to make acquisitions is going to be a factor. Now, that's not necessarily a bad thing for bank customers. It depends how they use this firepower. More competition around the world, new entrants into the banking industry, means more choice for customers, whether they're retail or wholesale. So that's not necessarily a bad thing for the banking system. At the moment, the evidence is, I think, that they're thinking of entering foreign markets, but in a fairly selective and cautious way. They're following some of their own Chinese customers, mainly the big state-owned corporations. And those corporations, in turn, tend to be concentrated in economies with a lot of natural resources. So you're seeing the banks extend their presence in areas like that, but in a very narrow way. The interesting question is if and when they start entering the retail banking industry, particularly in the sort of mature economies. For example, do they do what Santander has done from Spain, buy a British bank chain and become part of the market? I think they are cautious, and I think they're currently focused more on emerging markets, but they have potentially the resources and the ambition even to enter the richer markets like the UK and the US. The Chinese banks all have their origin in essentially one single sort of mega bank, if you like, the People's Bank of China. Under the Maoist communist period, there was only one bank, and indeed, I think Lenin once said you only need one bank under communism. Since then, the banks have been created as separate entities, originally to do quite specific things. You can see it in their names: the Industrial and Commercial Bank of China, the Agricultural Bank of China, China Construction Bank. But they've left those roots behind. Now, because they have become very big and powerful, and because they are an essential part of the mechanism by which the government controls the economy, they are inevitably politically very important. And several years ago, really in the mid-2000s, the ownership of the big 4 banks, the ones that really matter, shifted from the the People's Bank of China, the central bank, to the Ministry of Finance. And in almost all countries, there is a rivalry between these two institutions. And that rivalry hasn't gone away, and the political control of the banks will remain important for the foreseeable future. The history of the last 30 years of the banks in China is of booms and busts in lending, driven mostly by political purposes. One of the ways to get on in the Communist Party in China is to deliver GDP growth, national income growth, employment in your province. How do you do that? You borrow lots of money and you build bridges, airports, whatever. Some of this is good, some of it's probably wasted. And whether you pay it back is almost a matter of discretion. Consequently, the banks have been through 3 cycles of boom and bust, which have led them to end up with very large non-performing loans. Now, in the past, those loans that have gone bad have been dealt with by a mixture of recapitalization from the government, moving them into sort of off-balance sheet vehicles. The third boom and bust is the one that we've just had, which was the big boom in lending mandated by the government to essentially offset the global financial crisis in 2009. And we don't yet know how big those bad debts are going to be. But the extra lending was in the region of $1.5 trillion in 1 year. It's unavoidable, inevitable, that a large chunk of that's going to come back in the form of bad debts. And that could, if you're a pessimist, that could mean the banks are fundamentally insolvent. They will have to be bailed out. Now, that's tougher to do simply because the banks do have these foreign shareholders. In the past, it could all be done within the family. It's now going to be more complicated, more public, and that's going to be an interesting political problem, I think, for the future government.